Good evening and welcome to the General Fund Budget Hearing for Roseville Area Schools. We are required every December to have a Truth and Taxation hearing, but because our budget is actually set about this time of year, we always do an incremental hearing, which we present the budget findings in the preliminary budget, give people an opportunity to have input before the budget is finalized in June. Our Director of Business Services, Sherry Thompson, will be taking us through the budget.
Thank you, Chair Goggins. Tonight, yes, we will be reviewing the proposed general fund budget for the upcoming fiscal year, which runs from July 1st of 2019 through June 30th of 2020. The district holds this hearing before the budget is formally adopted each year because we do believe the residents of our community want and deserve to know how their tax dollars will be spent in the next year. This document is a draft of the recommended general fund budget for next school year. The final budget recommendation for this and all other funds will be presented to the board for approval at the board meeting on June 28th. After I've gone through the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. The board will not be discussing or taking action this evening. So our agenda for this evening, we'll talk a little bit about the budget process, the levy that the board sets and the resulting taxes. We'll review our revenue, our expenditures, and look at our fund balance projection. And again, while the focus of tonight's presentation is on the general fund school year 1920 budget, I will share some information regarding property taxes and comparative data from previous years. Most of the information is summarized, but more detailed information is available upon request. So looking at our timeline, we have quite an extensive timeline in developing our budget. The budget process is actually ongoing. The first step in the process actually began last fall. But the administration, we continue to review assumptions and the budgets on an ongoing basis. The formal budget process does start with a set of assumptions about enrollment and revenue. So as part of the levy setting process, the board approves the preliminary levy in September prior to the start of the fiscal year. We base those initial estimates on our enrollment projections. So that enrollment that we projected last summer is actually will be for the 1920 school year. The assumptions, as I said, are reviewed and updated periodically. The budget is a guideline or a roadmap. We sometimes need to adjust the plan based on newly acquired data. And then finally, the board is required to approve next year's budget, the preliminary prior to July 1. So again, the board sets the preliminary levy in September. The final levy is approved then, the middle of December. The board actually takes a look at revised current year budget numbers mid-year and does make some revision to the current year parameters. Also, that happens in January. The school board does then take formal action on assumptions for the upcoming year. Again, depending on, like this year was the first year, or will be the new year, 1920, will be the first year in the new biennium. So in that case, we have to make some assumptions about what we think the legislature may do as far as funding increases or changes there. And then also enrollment. We provide updates to the board periodically as needed, and we do a lot of the budget building prior to March 1st so that we can allocate staffing to our buildings for the upcoming school year. May 28th, again, this is prior to the actual board action in June. So we have the budget hearing tonight. We will administration will revisit the budget based on anything as far as presented tonight or any questions. The board will receive an update on June 11th, and then they will take action later in June at their second meeting. So some of the assumptions that we make, revenue, for instance, starting with the revenue, the current formula allowance, well, the current one as of last week, was $6,312. The board, or rather the legislature, has authorized, and that was wrapped up in the special session this weekend, an increase of 2% or $126 per pupil in our state basic funding. So we did make that assumption based on the parameters that were adopted earlier, that we would see a 2% increase. So the legislature's action does align with what we had included in our parameters. The district also has an operating referendum that is authorized by our voters. That's a per pupil funding amount. We receive $1,652 per pupil. We do have an inflationary factor built into our operating referendum. That the increase this year was 2.24% or $36 per pupil going into next year. It's also important to note that the operating referendum is for a specific period of time. Our current operating referendum is for an 8-year period. That authority will expire at the end of fiscal year 21-22. So that authority will need to be renewed prior to that time. We also saw an increase from the legislature as far as special ed cross-subsidy revenue. And basically what that helps is to offset increasing costs, because whatever expenses aren't covered by special education aid, the general fund ends up cross-subsidizing for those services. So they have introduced a new formula to help offset those increasing costs beginning next year. Our levy revenue is based on the levy that was certified last December. That was the 2018 paid 2019-20 certified levy. We are also looking, this is probably the first time since 2002 or 2003, that we are projecting a slight decline in our enrollment of about 1% or 75 students. Actually, we saw a little bit of a decline in the current year also, but that enrollment has increased for the last 15 years. We think that, well, part of this is due to the fact that our graduating classes is larger than our incoming classes. Another factor of this is, especially as we're going through construction, we are a district that benefits from open enrollment. We have as we're kind of trying to add on to some of our buildings, we have been closing our open enrollment in the last couple of years earlier than we have in previous years. So so we believe that is a factor as well. We've been closing in the spring rather than the fall or later. Do you want to come in and have a seat? Looking at the expenditure side, again, we focus our resources on equity and also student achievement. We did have this year some staffing adjustments. We actually do adjust our staffing based on enrollment. We have some target class sizes, ranges rather. We did increase those ranges this year by 0.5 at each grade level due to a projected budget deficit. We reduced overall about $800,000 this year. About just over $300,000 of that was in class by increasing the class size by 0.5. You can see the various ranges there, but these aren't the final class sizes because all of our sites actually do use some compensatory dollars to further buy down that class size number. We have built into our expenditure budget, we have built in estimated salary settlement costs for the upcoming year. Benefit costs for health, hospitalization, dental, life, and long-term disability benefits are also built into this projection, and they are estimated to stay at the current funding level of the cost would remain the same for the district. Utility costs will be based on multiple year average usage with consideration given to current rates. All mandated reserve expense categories, and we'll look a little bit more closely at those as we get further in, will be spent in compliance with state statute. We touched a little bit as far as our enrollment goes. So if we look at the last year, this looks at the 10-year average of our monthly enrollment by grade level. Again, for the first time since 2002, we've seen just a slight decrease. And again, we think that a factor of that is closing open enrollment earlier, and we have had some large senior classes that have graduated in the last 2 years. Looking a little bit further at our demographics, looking at our ethnic composition. Again, this is based on enrollment from last fall of 7,530. About 43% of our students are white students, and the remaining 57% are students of color. Looking at our LEP, so these are students that come from families whose first language are not English language learners. So we saw that peak as far as at a percentage. We were at about 17% in 2014, 2015. That number is dropped a little bit since then. So that number currently sits at 14% in the current year. We have also adjusted our staffing according to these numbers and our percentages. So we have seen a slight reduction in our staffing as far as English language learners. Again, we adapt this according to what the population looks like. Some of the reason that we see a drop here is that some of the students have actually mastered the English language, or they have received 7 years worth of service. Another factor that we think is important to share is as far as our demographics go, is our free and reduced meals. What do as far as qualification and our students in poverty. So this number has wavered in the upper 40 percentile the last couple of years. For the current year, we are at about 48%. We are at 46% last year. So again, we've kind of gone in anywhere between 45 to 50%. Some of our schools, because of course this is the overall district average, and some of our schools are in fact in excess of 50%. So it does vary at our elementaries. It can vary from site to site. So then looking a little bit as far as our levy. Now this is the levy that was approved in December by the school board. I think it's important to point out as far as the school district's levy, a levy is not just a wish list. We don't decide how much money we need to cover our expenses and determine what that levy to the taxpayers will be. A levy for a school district happens in one of two ways. It's either set by the state legislature as part of a formula, or it's approved by the local taxpayers. That is the only way that the board can authorize any kind of tax levy. So overall, looking, again, this is our general fund. The total general fund levy for the current year, or for the upcoming year, is $26.6 million. That's an increase of $2,145,000, or about 8.7% from the current year. The increase is attributable to a combination of things. Some of it was a combination of enrollment projection and enrollment going forward. We also saw an increase in the inflationary increase that was built into the operating referendum. And then also some prior year adjustments. So if we under project in previous years, the state calculation makes up for that, so that we never, in the end, we get adjustments so we don't over levy or under levy. So some of the larger big increases that we see here, of course, are attributable to our operating referendum and some of the back adjustments. So again, we're looking at an increase of $2.1 million for a total levy of 26.6, and this is just the general fund. Looking at some of our other funds, then our community service fund, we do receive levy dollars. We receive levy dollars for some of our early childhood learners. We also receive levy dollars for our students that are in our extended day programs, our before and after school care. So for some of those students with special needs, we also receive levy for some of our senior programs and our adult and youth enrichment. Overall, that levy is about $1 million. Looking at the upcoming year, that it is an increase of $144,650,000. Our debt service fund, the debt service is basically where we have the debt that includes the $144 million in construction bonds that were sold back in January of 2018. So this is basically the funding mechanism to pay off that debt. And then we also have the OPEB debt fund, and that is really debt that was issued back in 2009 to cover the debt that was out there for some of the severance and other retirement benefit programs that had been in place and were phased out back in like the 90s, 1994, I believe. But we do have a little bit of debt associated with that. So overall, the levy for the school district for 2018 payable 19, which is the 1920 school year, is $40,392,000. This is an increase of $2,473,000, or an overall increase of 6.53%. Looking then, some of the questions that come up, and we touched on this in our tax levy hearing in December, but we try and touch on it in the budget hearing as well, is what are the variables that impact property taxes, whether it's an increase or a decrease. So changes in a property's market value has an impact on the property tax. Market value credit, depending, again, that's determined by your property's value, and if the legislature makes any adjustments there. Sometimes if there's a change in a class rate, so if a property's been recategorized, that can have an impact. Voter approved referendums, and again, I will cite the bond referendum that was passed by the voters back in November of 2017. That has an impact on the property taxes, and then also any state adjustments or changes by the state legislature. So looking overall at our revenue, again, our revenue as far as general fund, most of this is comprised of local levy, state aid. We have also received some fees, and then some federal dollars. So I'm just going to touch on this a little bit by category. If we look at our local property taxes, we see an increase going into next year of about $1.8 million. Some of this is due to increase in formula, and then some of our prior year levy adjustments. The bottom half of the page, those are local fees, local revenues. So some of that is patrons or fees from student fees. We also receive interest earnings. We do some rentals of our school facilities. And then also gifts and bequests and miscellaneous revenue. That totals about $1.5 million. That's remained pretty constant the last couple of years. Where we will see an increase here is in some of our general education revenue, a decrease. In our general education revenue, we see a decrease of about $670,000. Some of that is for projected, not only the decreased student count, but also because our demographics changed a little bit. So, for instance, our free and reduced count went from 48% to 46%. So we're seeing an increase in some, or a decrease in some of that revenue. It's referred to as compensatory revenue. And we are anticipating a decrease there. We receive various state aids and grants. Some of that is integration revenue, transportation revenue. So we're anticipating a slight increase there. And then in our state aid for special education, we're anticipating an increase of about $385,000. So overall, well, I should touch on the federal aids and grants. We received various funding from the federal government. And just know also, if we see a decrease in federal funding, we decrease the expenses in those areas. If we see an increase in federal funding, we're able to increase some of the spending in that area, in those areas. Excuse me, and those do vary from year to year. So overall, we're looking at, we are anticipating revenue in the general fund of $100,686,000, which is overall an increase of about just under $1.4 million, or 1.39%. Looking at our expenditures, we tried to just break this out as far as by program area. So looking overall, you can see some of the changes here as far as in our administration area. So this is building principals, district administration. We're looking at an increase there of about $138,000. Our administrative support, we're looking at a reduction there, and we've done a little bit of restructuring there. And we're looking at a reduction of about 5.8 or $177,000. In our regular instruction, again, we have increased our class sizes targets, so we're looking at a reduction there of about $129,000. We also cost in some retirements there. Our vocational ed, we're looking at an increase of about $137,000. Our student services, which includes services to our special education students, we're anticipating an increase of about $345,000. Our instructional support area, that's includes our media centers. That's an increase of about $30,000 or 0.3%. Excuse me, pupil support. Those are things like nursing services. It also includes our transportation costs. We are anticipating an increase there of about $272,000. Much of that is in student transportation. We do contract that service out. We don't provide that internally. Our operations and maintenance, our buildings and grounds, we're looking at an increase there of about 2% or $116,000. And then under our insurance, and this is not employee benefits, this is like our property and liability insurance for the district. We're projecting an increase there of about $12,000. So overall, we are projecting that our expenses will increase by $745,000 for next year, or 0.7%. This next slide just basically, shows where, where we spend these dollars visually. So you can see that, we spend about, if you look at our regular instruction, vocational education instruction, and special ed, we spend about 66% of our budget on direct instruction, in addition to the instructional support areas and the pupil support. But 66% of our budget is spent on direct instruction. And then how does this translate overall, the summary? So our general fund is broken into different, there are different categories. And again, the general fund covers all of our day-to-day operating expenses. It's the majority of the expenses that flow through the district. We have it, again, it does break out into various categories. So the largest category is the unassigned. So those are funds that are mandated to be spent in certain areas. I'll start on the left and move to the right. Our projected fund balance as of June 30th of 2019. So again, we're making an assumption about the current year budget. And the unassigned is just under $2.4 million. So the unassigned, again, means there are no strings attached to it, no mandates. The board has full discretion in how these dollars are spent. We're anticipating revenue of $91.7 million in the unassigned category. Expenses of 91.4, almost 91.5. So we are projecting that our revenues will be in excess of our expenditures by $233,000. So we will be building a little bit more of a reserve in our fund balance. We'll take that from $2.4 million to $2.6 million. The board does have a fund balance policy of 3%. As far as in our unassigned fund balance, we are obviously, at the end of the year next year, as I said, that would be $2.6 million. So we are under that 3% target. There's been much discussion about that. We are working towards attaining that 3% goal, and also being mindful of the programs that we offer our students, so that we don't slash and burn those programs. So we are working towards getting to the 3%. Another category is non-spendable, and basically non-spendable is just things that we have either prepaid for the next year, or some of our inventory being like copy paper, some of our supplies as far as toner and whatnot. So that number varies from year to year. We do have some restricted accounts within the general fund. In most cases, in most of the cases, we can't run a negative balance, or it's not allowed. So in a lot of these cases, we actually spend more in some of these areas than we receive in revenue. But there again, we just reflect. We don't list any more in our expenditures than we have in revenue, because we can't run a negative balance. Staff development, for instance, we have revenue of about $1,058,000. I know in the current year we've spent like $2.3 million as far as staff development related expenses. So again, that money flows in and it flows out. Our compensatory education, I had mentioned that a few minutes ago. That's related to providing services based on some of our free and reduced counts, some of as far as student needs go. So we received $5.6 million This next year, that's a reduction of about $260,000 from the current year. Our learning and development, that's to keep some of our class sizes down at the elementary level. So we generate about $1.7 million has to be spent there. So you can see the revenue and the expenditure. We receive funding for gifted and talented programs. Again, this is another area. We generate about $107,000. We do spend in excess of that. Our school safety program. School safety programs basically help us to fund some of the supervision that we have. We do have school resource officers at the middle school and the high school. And then also some of the funding for some of the equipment that we have. Some of the cameras and whatnot throughout the district. And personnel at some of our school sites. Health and safety, that is a program that's being phased out. So we've got a deficit there, and actually that deficit through the levy process will zero out probably by the end of the 2021 school year. Operating capital, again, this is part of the general fund. Operating capital really basically funds all of our technology, some of our textbooks, equipment. So again, we generate about $2.6 million in revenue. And this is a case, sometimes we have generated more than we've spent. We can carry a fund balance there. We can't carry a negative fund balance for more than a year. But we are anticipating that we'll continue to carry a fund balance forward in that area. And then we also have long-term facility maintenance. Some of that is the cost of maintaining some of our health and safety programs and also some of our deferred maintenance. In addition to the general fund, we also have long-term facility maintenance under one of our construction accounts. So again, that will also zero out. So overall, our general fund budget is about $104 million in both revenues and expenditures. And again, I want to stress the unassigned fund balance as far as our reserves there. It's no different than your checking account or your savings at home. So that's something that we are mindful of because those are basically our reserves and help us to also cover our cash flow throughout the year. That is all I have. I don't know if there are any questions or comments.
Do we have any questions or comments from the audience? Okay, well, thank you very much for all of you coming this evening. If the audience from the TV have any questions, they're certainly very welcome to call the district office. The presentation will be up on the internet and available to anybody interested as of tomorrow.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, we will have it up.
So we appreciate any input or feedback people have. Thank you very much for your time. We'll take a 5-minute break and we'll begin the school board meeting.